In the decades before the Second World War, the people who would later form the 442nd Regimental Combat Team lived within a complex web of local community life and global tension. In 1940, the United States counted roughly 127,000 persons of Japanese ancestry in the mainland states, about two-thirds of them American-born Nisei, and around 157,000 in the territory of Hawaii, where people of Japanese descent formed a large share of the population. These communities developed around agriculture, fishing, small businesses, and urban neighborhoods in places such as Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, Honolulu, and Hilo. Many first-generation immigrants, the Nisei, remained ineligible for naturalization under U.S. law, while their children, born in the United States, held citizenship by birth. This legal distinction would become central once war began. At the same time, relations between Washington and Tokyo deteriorated. Japan's expansion into Manchuria in 1931 and into central and southern China after 1937 prompted U.S. embargoes on oil, scrap metal, and other strategic materials, and a growing debate in American political circles over how to respond. Japanese leaders, dependent on imported resources, viewed these restrictions as pressure on their regional ambitions. U.S. military planners, in turn, treated Japan as a potential adversary in the Pacific, conducting war games and staff studies that assumed conflict over access to Asian markets and sea lanes. Within the United States, public perceptions of Japan and of Japanese immigrants were shaped by earlier immigration disputes on the West Coast and by racial segregation more broadly. Exclusion laws and restrictive land measures in states such as California and Washington limited land ownership and naturalization for Asian immigrants. Newspapers and civic organizations sometimes framed Japan both as a modern power and as a potential threat, and some commentators questioned the loyalty of U.S. residents of Japanese ancestry in the event of war. Other officials, religious groups, and civic leaders emphasized constitutional rights and pointed to the lack of evidence for organized subversion. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed these debates into urgent security questions. In Hawaii, where people of Japanese ancestry worked in dockyards, plantations, and the Territorial Guard, the immediate concern for U.S. Army commanders was maintaining labor and order under martial law while defending a forward base under threat. On the mainland, especially along the Pacific coast, Army and Navy intelligence officers, local politicians, and federal agencies disagreed over the scale of the internal danger. Some reports from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Office of Naval Intelligence stated that the majority of Japanese Americans did not pose a security risk, while others warned of hypothetical sabotage. Under these conditions, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on the 19th of February 1942, authorizing military commanders to designate exclusion zones and remove persons from them. The Western Defense Command then ordered the relocation of about 110,000 to 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the coastal regions of California, Oregon, Washington, and parts of Arizona to assembly centers and later to inland camps administered by the War Relocation Authority. Two-thirds of those removed were Nisei citizens. Families left farms, shops, and urban residences under varying degrees of pressure, and legal challenges proceeded through the courts at the same time that the war in the Pacific expanded. In Hawaii, military and territorial authorities chose a different approach. Despite the presence of about 150,000 residents of Japanese ancestry, they implemented selective detentions rather than mass exclusion, citing the need to maintain the workforce and the logistical difficulties of large-scale removal from the islands. A smaller number of individuals were interned under separate Department of Justice and Army programs. This divergence between mainland and territorial policy would later shape the composition of Japanese American units in the U.S. Army. Within the War Department, the question of whether and how to use Nisei soldiers developed alongside broader manpower planning. Before the war, Japanese Americans had served in the pre-war National Guard and in the peacetime Army in limited numbers. After Pearl Harbor, Nisei already in uniform faced discharge, reassignment, or restrictions on combat roles as the Army re-evaluated security policies. At the same time, the rapid expansion of U.S. forces in 1942 created demand for trained personnel, linguists, and infantry replacements. In 1942, the U.S. Army authorized the formation of the 100th Infantry Battalion from Nisei soldiers of the Hawaii National Guard, who had been separated from the 298th and 299th Infantry Regiments and organized as a provisional unit. Their deployment to the mainland for training created an early test case for employing Japanese-American soldiers in overseas operations. Observations of their performance, discipline, and public reaction on the mainland informed subsequent War Department deliberations. By late 1942 and early 1943, these various strands, strategic needs in Europe and the Pacific, legal debates over citizenship and rights, labor requirements in Hawaii, and assessments of loyalty, converged in discussions over creating a larger segregated unit composed primarily of Nisei volunteers. Officials in Washington considered intelligence reports, political pressures from Hawaiian and mainland delegations, and the positions of the War Department General Staff. The eventual decision to authorize what would become the 442nd Regimental Combat Team arose from this combination of global conflict, domestic security policy, and the specific demographic situation of Japanese Americans in both the mainland states and the territory of Hawaii. In early 1943, the discussions within the War Department and the administration moved from general policy to concrete organization. On 28 January 1943, the War Department announced that it would form a segregated unit composed primarily of Americans of Japanese ancestry. The new formation was designated the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, with an authorized strength of about 4,000 officers and enlisted men. Its structure followed standard Army patterns: a regimental headquarters and headquarters company, 3 infantry battalions, a cannon company, an anti-tank company, a medical detachment, and attached support units that would later include the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion and the 232nd Engineer Company. The call for volunteers was issued simultaneously to the territory of Hawaii and to the War Relocation Authority centers on the mainland. In Hawaii, Army and territorial officials coordinated recruitment through existing National Guard and Reserve channels. Public meetings, notices, and radio broadcasts informed eligible Nisei men that a new combat team was being organized for overseas service. Many of those approached had served previously in the 298th and 299th Infantry Regiments, or in other territorial units before being placed on restricted duty after December 1941, and recruitment officers noted that they already possessed basic training. In the mainland camps, the process followed different administrative lines. War Relocation Authority staff and Army liaison officers distributed questionnaires and held informational sessions in guarded environments where families lived behind barbed wire. The same document that asked Nisei men between certain ages about their willingness to serve also posed questions on loyalty and willingness to forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. These questions, especially as applied to non-citizen Issei parents and to Nisei, who had been removed from their homes without trial, produced varied reactions. Some camp residents agreed to volunteer, seeing military service as a way to assert civic status or to leave the camps. Others declined, citing the conditions of confinement, concerns for family members, or objections to specific questionnaire wording. Officials in Washington and in field commands monitored these responses. Reports from Hawaii indicated that several thousand men presented themselves as volunteers, more than the initial quota of around 3,000 requested from the islands. On the mainland, by contrast, the number of volunteers from the camps was lower than some planners had anticipated, with roughly 1,200 men eventually accepted. War Department memoranda recorded both the numerical results and interpretations of regional differences, pointing to factors such as economic prospects in Hawaii, the impact of mass removal on the West Coast, and varying degrees of contact between Japanese American communities and military institutions. The 100th Infantry Battalion, composed mainly of earlier Nisei National Guard members from Hawaii, proceeded on a parallel track. Detached from the Hawaiian Division in mid-1942 and sent to the mainland, the battalion trained at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and later at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Although not initially under the 442nd's regimental headquarters, the 100th served as a practical reference point for officers assessing Nisei performance. Training inspectors commented on marksmanship, field exercises, and discipline using the same criteria applied to other units, while intelligence branches continued to evaluate security procedures. The activation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team took place at Camp Shelby in the spring of 1943. Officers drawn from various parts of the Army, including some with prior experience in infantry and artillery units, received assignments to command companies and battalions. Most enlisted men were Nisei, with a smaller number of non-Nisei specialists in technical roles. The camp, located in southern Mississippi, already hosted other training formations, creating opportunities for comparison in drills, maneuver problems, and evaluations. Reactions from different segments of the U.S. public were mixed. Some newspapers and civic groups expressed support for the decision to allow Nisei volunteers to serve in a distinct unit, emphasizing manpower needs and references to constitutional principles. Other commentators questioned the policy, citing ongoing concerns about espionage or sabotage despite the absence of large-scale documented cases. For military planners, however, the primary considerations were training standards, command cohesion, and the allocation of the new regiment to an overseas theater once its preparation phase was complete. Within Japanese-American communities, the opening phase of the 442nd's existence produced further debates. Families in Hawaii and in the camps weighed the risks of frontline service against the conditions of wartime life and the uncertain post-war future. Some local community organizations assisted with farewell ceremonies, financial arrangements, or care for dependents. Religious groups of various denominations recorded differing responses, with some leaders emphasizing duty to country and others focusing on pastoral care for those departing and for those who chose not to volunteer. Thus, by mid-1943, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team existed as a formally constituted unit on paper and at Camp Shelby, while its broader significance was still being defined in training grounds, in administrative reports, and in the discussions of families dispersed between the islands, the mainland interior, and the West Coast exclusion zones. As the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, organized at Camp Shelby in 1943, planners in Washington and in theater commands considered how this formation would fit into the wider structure of Allied strategy. The United States was expanding its ground forces for campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and, later, continental Europe. The War Department General Staff aimed to build a force structure of dozens of infantry divisions, supported by Corps and Army-level assets, to operate alongside British and other Allied units. In this context, the 442nd was conceived as an infantry regiment that could be attached to existing divisions as needed, rather than as the core of an independent division. Strategic goals for the regiment operated on several levels. Militarily, the 442nd was to provide a fully trained infantry combat team, equipped and organized according to standard U.S. tables of organization. This meant 3 infantry battalions of roughly 800 men each, a field artillery battalion with 105mm howitzers, an engineer company, an anti-tank company with towed anti-tank guns, and supporting medical and service elements. The regiment would use the same weapons and equipment as comparable U.S. units: M1 rifles, Browning automatic rifles, light and heavy machine guns, 60mm and 81mm mortars, radios, trucks, and jeeps. Its employment would depend on operational requirements in whichever theater it was assigned. Politically and domestically, the unit also played a role in debates over loyalty and citizenship. Officials in the War Department and the Roosevelt administration were aware that the existence and performance of a Nisei combat unit would be observed by members of Congress, civil rights organizations, and newspapers that followed developments in both Hawaii and the mainland camps. Some saw the unit as one element in demonstrating that policy could distinguish between enemy governments abroad and U.S. citizens of the same ancestry at home. Others treated it primarily as a manpower measure, one component in mobilizing available citizens for service. Axis governments monitored these developments through intelligence and propaganda. Japanese broadcasts in 1943 referred to American use of Nisei soldiers in different ways, sometimes portraying them as evidence of U.S. coercion, sometimes using them to argue that Japanese communities abroad had broken ties with the homeland. German propaganda organs, focused on Europe, mentioned U.S. use of minority units mainly to depict the United States as a heterogeneous coalition. For Allied planners, these external interpretations were secondary to the practical questions of where the regiment could best be used. Within the U.S. Army, staff officers debated the appropriate theater for deployment. Some early proposals considered using Nisei infantry in the Pacific, but concerns were raised about the risk of misidentification by Allied troops, the psychological effect on Japanese forces, and the difficulties of operating among civilian populations of similar appearance to the soldiers. As a result, planners increasingly favored assignment to the European theater of operations, or the Mediterranean theater, where enemy forces were German and Italian units and the civilian populations were European. The planning process also addressed logistics and integration. The 442nd needed to be trained to the same standards as other infantry regiments, with emphasis on small unit tactics, night movements, river crossings, and combined arms cooperation with artillery and armor. Camp Shelby provided maneuver areas where the regiment could conduct battalion-level field exercises and live-fire training. Quartermaster officers calculated the requirements for uniforms, weapons, ammunition, food, and transport, while medical officers set up aid stations and evacuation procedures in line with Army doctrine. At the same time, the 100th Infantry Battalion, already training on the mainland and scheduled for overseas movement, entered war plans for the Mediterranean theater. This battalion, with an authorized strength of around 1,300 men, was designated to join a division that would fight in Italy under Fifth Army. Staff officers noted that if the 442nd later moved to the same theater, the battalion could be attached to it, formally or informally, depending on operational needs. Thus, planning documents began to link the futures of the 100th and the 442nd, even before they met in combat zones. Training schedules at Camp Shelby translated these strategic considerations into daily routines. Recruits and volunteers followed standardized courses in marksmanship, drill, fieldcraft, and weapons handling. Instructors evaluated platoons and companies through time marches, obstacle courses, and simulated assaults. Intelligence and security sections maintained surveillance procedures comparable to those in other units, while also handling inquiries from higher headquarters interested in any signs of divided loyalty. Reports from these inspections stated whether the regiment met the same criteria as other formations for eventual deployment overseas. Propaganda and public information arrangements formed another component of planning, the Office of War. Information and Army public relations branches prepared newsreels, photographs, and written features about the 442nd for distribution to newspapers, radio programs, and military newspapers. These materials emphasized factual elements such as unit organization, training milestones, and ceremonies, while omitting operational details that could aid enemy intelligence. In Hawaii and in the mainland camps, copies of such reports circulated among families and community groups, shaping expectations about where and how the regiment would be used once training was complete and higher command issued deployment orders. The first sustained combat experience associated with the future 442nd Regimental Combat Team came from the 100th Infantry Battalion's deployment to the Mediterranean. In June 1943, the 100th, with an authorized strength of roughly 1,300 men, sailed from the mainland United States to North Africa and was attached to the U.S. 34th Infantry Division. There, it completed additional field training in conditions closer to a combat theater, route marches under heat, live fire exercises, and coordination drills with artillery and engineers. Staff officers of Fifth Army evaluated the battalion using the same reports used for other infantry units, noting rates of training completion and equipment serviceability. In September 1943, Allied landings at Salerno opened the mainland Italian campaign. Fifth Army, consisting of several U.S. and British divisions, advanced inland against German 10th Army formations, tasked with delaying the Allied approach to central Italy. Around 22nd September, the 100th Infantry Battalion landed near Salerno and moved into the line as part of the 34th Infantry Division deployment. For the Nisei soldiers, this constituted the transition from training to frontline operations. For German commanders, it meant encountering another U.S. infantry battalion among many units pressing northward from the beaches. Initial engagements took place in broken terrain of hills, river valleys, and villages between Salerno and the Volturno River. The 100th conducted patrols, company-sized attacks, and defensive positions along routes used by German forces withdrawing in stages. Communications and artillery support followed standard Fifth Army procedures, with forward observers coordinating fire from divisional artillery and higher echelon guns. German units, including elements of infantry and panzergrenadier formations, used demolitions, mines, and prepared positions to slow the advance and to inflict casualties before pulling back to successive defensive lines. From the perspective of the 34th Division Command, the 100th was one of several battalions needed to maintain continuous pressure on the German line. Orders assigned sectors, objectives such as specific ridgelines or road junctions, and times for coordinated attacks with adjacent units. Battalion after action reports recorded distances advanced, numbers of prisoners taken, and own losses in killed, wounded, and missing. Over the autumn of 1943, these reports show that the 100th, starting from about 1,300 men, suffered several hundred casualties in successive actions, contributing to the later total of more than 600 battle casualties during its first campaigns. German accounts from divisional and regimental headquarters focused on the overall Allied advance, rather than on the ethnic composition of individual U.S. units. Situation reports describe pressure from American infantry and armor, artillery concentrations, and the impact of Allied air attacks on movement and supply routes. Commanders of German 10th Army aimed to trade space for time, withdrawing from one river line to the next, while preserving combat power for later defenses south of Rome and at the Gustav Line. Italian civilians in the regions of Benevento, the Volturno Valley, and surrounding villages experienced the early clashes as a combination of military occupation, bombardment, and changing authority. As Fifth Army moved north and German units withdrew, local populations encountered requisitioning, property damage from artillery and airstrikes, and the disruption of transport and agriculture. Allied civil affairs units attempted to restore basic services and food distribution, while combat operations continued nearby, but their resources remained limited compared with the scale of displacement. While the 100th fought through these initial phases in southern Italy, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was still completing training at Camp Shelby. Orders for its eventual overseas movement were under discussion but not yet executed. Thus, at this stage, the clash associated with Nisei formations was concentrated in a single battalion integrated into a larger divisional structure. Its performance was observed by Fifth Army headquarters, by War Department analysts reviewing casualty and effectiveness data, and by Japanese-American communities following brief mentions in military newspapers and censored letters. The information gathered in these first months of combat would influence later decisions about reinforcing the battalion, pairing it with the 442nd, and assigning the combined Nisei formation to more demanding operations further north in the Italian theater. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Italian campaign entered a more demanding phase for all formations involved, including the 100th Infantry Battalion. Fifth Army confronted a layered German defensive system anchored on river lines and mountain ridges, culminating in the Gustav Line. German 10th Army, under a unified theater strategy, concentrated infantry, panzergrenadier, and artillery units in depth, using the terrain to compensate for Allied superiority in artillery and air power. This approach required repeated frontal assaults by Allied infantry, extended over months, and generated rising casualty figures across divisions and battalions. The 100th participated in actions around San Pietro and Fiemme and along approaches to the Rapido River and Cassino sector, company and platoon-level operations often involved advancing up steep slopes under mortar and machine gun fire, clearing stone farmhouses and terraces, and holding exposed positions in winter conditions. Battalion morning reports showed a gradual reduction in effective rifle strength as combat deaths, wounds, trench foot, sickness, and non-battle injuries accumulated. From an original figure of roughly 1,300 officers and men, the number present for duty at various points fell to around half that total, necessitating drafts of replacements from training depots. German units on the opposing ridges faced their own forms of crisis. Commanders were ordered to delay the Allied advance as long as possible without allowing encirclement, a task that required holding forward positions under sustained artillery and air bombardment. German casualty lists from winter 1943 to 1944 in the Casino sector indicate significant losses in infantry companies, with some units reporting only a fraction of their authorized strength after successive attacks. Supply lines running north through the Apennines were disrupted by air raids and damaged bridges, complicating delivery of ammunition and rations to frontline positions. Weather and terrain intensified the difficulties for both sides. Heavy rains turned roads into mud, limiting the movement of trucks and artillery. Mountain tracks could only be supplied by mules or human porters, and evacuating wounded personnel down steep slopes under fire required large numbers of stretcher bearers and engineers. In this environment, tactical success was measured in the capture of specific hills or villages rather than in rapid advances. The 100th Battalion sector became one part of a wider front in which divisions from the United States, Britain, France, and other Allied states attempted to force a breach. At the strategic level, Allied leaders responded to the stalemate at the Gustav Line by planning amphibious operations to outflank German positions. This led to the landings at Anzio in January 1944 by 6th Corps, while 5th Army continued frontal pressure further south. Although the 100th was not among the initial Anzio landing units, its continued engagement along the main front contributed to tying down German formations that might otherwise have been shifted to the beachhead. German commanders, in turn, redistributed reserves between the Casino front and Anzio, seeking to contain the new threat while maintaining the main line in central Italy. Within the U.S. Army personnel system, the losses suffered by the 100th created administrative challenges. Replacements had to be found who could be integrated into a battalion whose enlisted personnel were overwhelmingly Nisei. Some reinforcements were drawn from other Nisei soldiers in training or from units being reorganized, while other infantry replacements came from different backgrounds. Commanders balanced the need to maintain cohesion in a battalion with a distinct origin against broader manpower constraints affecting all combat units in the theater. During this period, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team moved closer to deployment. After completing training cycles at Camp Shelby, the regiment received orders for overseas movement in early 1944. Embarkation from ports on the U.S. East Coast took place using standard troopship procedures. Staging in camps near ports, medical inspections, equipment checks, and security briefings. The regiment's authorized strength of around 4,000 men required detailed loading plans to allocate companies, weapons, vehicles, and supplies among ships convoyed across the Atlantic to ports in North Africa or Italy. On the home front, the escalation of fighting in Italy intersected with continuing debates over internment and civil liberties. Reports of Nisei casualties in Italy reached families in Hawaii and in the War Relocation Authority centers through official telegrams and censored letters. Community newspapers, where permitted, printed casualty lists and brief summaries of battalion activities without operational details. Some observers cited these reports as evidence that Japanese-American soldiers faced the same risks as other U.S. units, while others focused on the contrast between frontline service and ongoing confinement of relatives in inland camps. Axis Information Services also monitored the campaign. German and Italian broadcasts described the slow Allied progress and emphasized German defensive tenacity, portraying the fighting at Casino and along the Liri Valley as proof that the Allied advance into Europe could be delayed. Specific reference to Nisei units remained limited, as German staff documents mainly categorized enemy forces by national command, rather than by internal ethnic composition. For Japanese leaders, the Italian campaign was a secondary theater, but intelligence summaries noted that U.S. forces fighting in Europe included personnel of varied backgrounds, reflecting broader mobilization patterns. By the time the 442nd approached its own commitment to combat, the Italian front had already entered a stage characterized by accumulated losses, logistical strain, and political questions over the value of continued offensive operations in difficult terrain. The experience of the 100th provided a concrete example of how a Nisei unit functioned under these conditions, while the wider crisis of attrition and stalled offensives shaped the context in which the combined Nisei formation would soon be employed in intensified operations further north. In June 1944, the process that had begun with recruitment and training reached its most concentrated combat phase. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team disembarked in Italy and moved to Civitavecchia, north of Rome, where it joined 5th Army's advance during the Rome-Arno campaign. On 11 June, the 100th Infantry Battalion, already experienced from months of fighting, was attached to the 442nd. On 15 June, it came under the combat team's operational control, and in August, it was formally designated the 1st Battalion of the regiment, while retaining its separate numerical title in recognition of its earlier record. 5th Army planners now had a combined Nisei formation of several thousand men to employ on a continuous offensive toward the Arno River. The first large engagement of the unified formation occurred on 26 June at Belvedere di Suvareto in Tuscany. The 442nd, attached to the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, received orders to seize a ridge and village system held by German forces screening the approaches to coastal road and rail routes. 2nd and 3rd Battalions advanced frontally, while the 100th moved along covered routes to reach high ground east of the village. As the German battalion defending Belvedere concentrated its fire on the U.S. troops pushing directly toward the settlement, the 100th blocked the exits and struck from the flank. U.S. after-action accounts state that the German battalion was effectively destroyed and the town taken, with 442nd casualties that day, including 11 men killed and additional wounded. For 5th Army, this showed that the new regiment could be integrated into divisional attacks under standard procedures. The fighting did not end with Belvedere. Over the following weeks, the 100th/442nd pushed through a series of hill positions and small towns: Sassetta, crossings over the Cecina River, Hill 140, Castellina Maritima, and villages such as Pastina and Pieve di San Luce. Hill 140, a dominant feature controlling routes toward the port of Livorno, became a focal point. A single German battalion, supported by artillery pre-registered on every slope and farm building, held the hill and its ridges. For several days, U.S. companies gained only limited ground under concentrated fire. Regimental reports estimated about 250 enemy dead on positions overrun by the 442nd in the final phase of this action. German accounts from the sector emphasized the use of terrain, cave positions, and interlocking fields of fire to compensate for Allied artillery and air power. U.S. casualties mounted as the regiment advanced. In the 3 weeks of July that included Hill 140 and the subsequent town fighting, U.S. sources attributed about 1,100 enemy dead and 331 prisoners to actions involving the 100th 442nd. The Nisei formation itself lost 1,272 men in the Rome-Arno push from Rome to the Arno River, a distance of roughly 64 kilometers, 239 killed, 972 wounded, 17 missing, and 44 non-combat casualties. These figures were in line with the attrition affecting other infantry regiments engaged in continuous offensives in central Italy, where every riverline and ridge could be fortified and used to exact losses from advancing units. Italian civilians in Tuscany experienced this phase of the campaign as a progression of successive occupiers and front lines. German forces had previously requisitioned food, livestock, and labor while preparing defensive positions. As U.S. units approached, German rear guards carried out demolitions of bridges and infrastructure, and sometimes imposed further requisitions. the fighting around Hill 140 and nearby towns brought artillery fire and airstrikes close to inhabited areas. After the front passed, Allied civil affairs detachments attempted to restore basic administration, organize distribution of flour and fuel, and clear mines and unexploded ordnance. But resources were limited relative to the number of affected villages. For commanders of German 10th and 14th Armies, this period represented an attempt to conduct an organized withdrawal toward the Apennine positions that would become the Gothic Line, trading ground for time while inflicting casualties. They rotated depleted battalions out of the line when possible, but the pressure from 5th Army and the 8th Army further east constrained these movements. Nisei units appeared in German situation maps simply as parts of U.S. divisions designated by standard symbols. German reports analyzed the pattern of Allied attacks and artillery preparation without focusing on the internal composition of enemy regiments. Within the 442nd, the peak tempo of operations required continuous logistical adaptation. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion fired frequent missions in support of infantry advances. The 232nd Engineers cleared minefields and repaired roads under observation. Medical detachments had to move aid stations forward rapidly as new positions were taken. Replacement flows struggled to keep pace with losses, a problem common to all 5th Army infantry units in the summer campaign. Depot personnel allocated individual replacements based on training and availability, sometimes sending Nisei soldiers from other pools, sometimes assigning non-Nisei infantrymen, which affected the internal balance of language and background within companies. At the same time, a specialized role emerged for part of the combat team. On July 15th, the regiment's anti-tank company was detached from the front and assigned to the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment within the 1st Airborne Task Force. After training near Rome in glider operations and in handling British 6-pounder anti-tank guns suitable for air transport, these soldiers participated in the glider landings of Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France that began on August 15, 1944. Their tasks included securing landing zones near Le Mouilly, deploying anti-tank guns, clearing mines, and guarding routes and tunnels on the flank of the U.S. 7th Army. For the duration of that campaign, they operated alongside airborne units rather than with the main body of the 442nd still in Italy. By late July, the 100th 442nd had reached the line of the Arno River, effectively concluding its role in the Rome-Arno campaign. After a short period of rest and limited patrolling along the river, the combat team was detached from 5th Army on 11 September and attached to the U.S. 36th Infantry Division of 7th Army in preparation for operations in France. The months between June and August 1944 thus marked a peak phase in which the Nisei Regiment, integrated into standard U.S. divisional structures, conducted successive offensive actions against German defenses in central Italy, while one of its companies took part in airborne operations over southern France, creating a record of sustained combat that would shape both subsequent tactical employment and post-war assessments of the unit. When the 442nd Regimental Combat Team left Italy and landed at Marseille at the end of September 1944, it entered a theater in which both sides were adjusting to new constraints. 7th Army's rapid advance up the Rhone Valley had slowed as German 19th Army pulled back into the Vosges Mountains and stabilized a defensive line covering approaches to Alsace and the German border. The 442nd, numbering about 2,943 officers and men when attached to the U.S. 36th Infantry Division on October 13th, now faced a landscape very different from the open ridges and valleys of central Italy. Dense forests, steep ravines, fog, and autumn rain. The first major task for the 100th/442nd in France was the capture of Bruyères, a rail junction town about 40 kilometers from the German frontier. The town was surrounded by 4 wooded hills labeled A, B, C, and D in operations orders. On October 15th, the 100th Battalion attacked Hill A, held by elements of SS Polizei Regiment 19, while 2nd Battalion moved against Hill B, and 3rd Battalion advanced through a valley toward the town. Over 4 days of fighting, American units cleared machine gun nests and sniper positions under continuous artillery fire and poor visibility. Once Hills A and B fell, 3rd Battalion and elements of the 36th Division's 142nd Infantry entered Bruyères from the south. After 3 days, the town changed hands, and U.S. reports recorded 134 prisoners from several German and auxiliary formations, including Fusilier Battalion 198 and Grenadier Regiment 736. German commanders in the Vosges sought to use terrain and weather as force multipliers. Orders to frontline units stressed holding wooded ridges, pre-sighting artillery and mortars on likely approach routes, and conducting local counterattacks whenever U.S. forces exposed flanks on narrow forest tracks. The hills around Bruyères were integrated into this system. Once the town fell, German units on Hills C and D continued to shell it from above. The 442nd initially pushed German forces off both heights, but did not fully secure them. German troops infiltrated back during darkness, forcing renewed assaults that added roughly 100 further casualties when Hill C was retaken. Bifontaine, a village east of Bruyères, became the next focal point. The 100th and 2nd Battalion advanced through forest and logged clearings, encountering mines, booby traps, and delayed demolition charges. French civilians in the area, including members of local resistance groups, provided information on trails and German positions, but also faced reprisals risk if caught assisting Allied forces. German withdrawals through villages left damaged infrastructure and occasionally forced labor detachments composed of local residents. Allied artillery observers balanced the need to suppress German fire with efforts to limit destruction of civilian buildings used as temporary shelters or aid posts. For the 442nd, adaptation to these conditions occurred on several levels. Tactically, companies shifted from the longer-range engagements common on Italian ridges to close-quarter firefights in dense woods, where visibility was often limited to a few dozen meters. Platoons used bounding movements from tree to tree, coordinated with short, intense artillery concentrations from the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion and with engineer teams clearing paths through felled logs and anti-vehicle obstacles. Night patrolling increased as units tried to identify gaps in German lines or to intercept infiltration attempts. Radio communications were complicated by terrain, so runners and prearranged flare signals remained important. Logistically, supply and evacuation required new routines. Trucks could bring rations and ammunition only as far as forest edge dumps. From there, carrying parties and mule trains moved loads forward along muddy trails. Evacuation of wounded men from steep ravines under fire demanded large numbers of litter bearers and coordination between regimental medical detachments and divisional ambulance companies. Weather-related illnesses such as trench foot rose as soldiers remained in wet clothing and boots, and commanders had to rotate companies where possible to rear areas for drying, even as overall manpower dwindled. Psychologically, soldiers and commanders contended with the cumulative effect of continuous operations in limiting terrain. The 100th had been in combat for over a year. Many of its original 1,432 men had become casualties, leaving 239 infantrymen and 21 officers by mid-November. 2nd Battalion had 316 riflemen and 17 officers, and no company in 3rd Battalion had more than 100 riflemen. The entire 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team was down to fewer than 800 soldiers fit for frontline duty, compared with 2,943 when it entered the Vosges. These figures were consistent with the attrition seen in other infantry regiments in prolonged forest fighting, but carried particular weight for a unit with a distinctive recruitment base and limited pools of culturally similar replacements. On the German side, adaptation took the form of regrouping depleted battalions from formations such as the 244th Infantry Division and the 716th Infantry Division, using ad hoc battle groups to plug gaps in the line. Commanders shifted companies between sectors to meet U.S. attacks on successive hills and ridges. Supply difficulties mirrored those on the Allied side. Ammunition and rations moved through narrow mountain roads, subject to air attack and artillery interdiction. German situation reports recorded concerns about being driven out of the Vosges, which would expose the Alsace plain and river crossings toward the interior of the Reich. In late October, as both sides were adjusting to sustained forest combat, and after the 100th 442nd had only briefly been pulled into reserve, a new crisis developed nearby. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division, advanced into wooded high ground near Bifontaine, became isolated, and was cut off by German counterattacks. Approximately 275 men were surrounded with limited food, water, and medical supplies. Attempts by other battalions of the 141st to break through failed. In this situation, 7th Army and 36th Division commanders faced a choice between halting operations in the sector or ordering already depleted units back into action. Their decision to recall the 442nd from its short rest and commit it to renewed attacks in the same difficult terrain set the stage for the sequence of events that would form the next major phase of the regiment's campaign. Orders to re-enter the Vosges line reached the 442nd Regimental Combat Team on October 26, 1944, after less than 2 days in reserve. The unit had just completed operations around Bruyères and Bifontaine when Corps and Division headquarters directed it back into the same forests to assist the 141st Infantry Regiment. On October 24th, the 1st Battalion, 141st, advancing on a narrow ridge east of Bifontaine, had been cut off by German counterattacks. About 275 soldiers from Companies A, B, C, and a platoon of D Company were surrounded roughly 2 kilometers behind German lines, with limited food, water, and medical supplies. Initial attempts by the 141st's other 2 battalions to reopen the corridor failed. German forces from elements of 244th and 716th Infantry Divisions, supported by mountain troops and fusilier units, used pre-sighted mortars, machine guns, and artillery to seal the approaches on the forested slopes. Air support in the form of P-47s from the 405th Fighter Squadron dropped canisters of rations, medical supplies, and radio batteries into the surrounded perimeter, while German artillery and small arms tried to disrupt both the airdrops and any ground movement in or out of the pocket. Inside the encirclement, the 114th dug in on the ridgeline and rationed its remaining water, food, and ammunition, reporting its situation to higher headquarters by radio whenever conditions allowed. On the morning of 27th October, the 442nd moved out to attempt a breakthrough. The combat team's strength on attachment to the 36th Division earlier in the month had been 2,943 officers and men. By this point, casualties in the Bruyères and Bifontaine fighting had already reduced its effective rifle strength. The new mission required advancing along narrow forest roads and ridges where German units had already repelled multiple attacks and had adjusted their fire plans to likely approach routes. The 100th Battalion led in some sectors, with 2nd and 3rd Battalions operating on adjacent axes. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion provided close support with 105mm howitzers, while engineers tried to clear paths through mines, felled trees, and wire. German defenders adapted to the renewed offensive by concentrating fire on choke points where steep slopes and ravines compressed advancing companies into narrow fronts. Mortar and artillery shells burst in treetops, sending fragments downward, a pattern common in forest fighting. Counterattacks aimed at the flanks of any platoon that gained a foothold beyond the main line. German reports from the Vosges in this period describe American attempts to force passage with repeated assaults supported by heavy artillery, and indicate local shortages of infantry replacements and ammunition in the defending battalions. For the 442nd, progress toward the isolated battalion came at high cost. Companies advanced in short rushes between trees, often engaging at ranges of tens of meters. Communication between platoons relied on runners and prearranged signals when radios failed in the terrain. Casualty reports compiled after the operation indicate that in 5 days of fighting, from October 26th to 30, the 442nd suffered roughly 800 killed, wounded, or missing, while forcing the German line back far enough to reach the 1/141. Some rifle companies were reduced to a few dozen effectives. One account notes Company Y, entering the operation with 185 men and emerging with only a small number uninjured. Company K began with 186 and saw most of its personnel listed as killed or wounded. Artillery coordination created its own turning points during the advance. On at least one occasion, a fire mission ordered by division headquarters on coordinates believed to mark German positions would have fallen on the surrounded Texans. Forward observers from the 522nd, in contact with both the 442nd's leading elements and the 114's perimeter, recognized the discrepancy and adjusted the fire plan, preventing friendly shells from striking the encircled battalion. This episode illustrated both the risk of misidentification in complex terrain and the degree of interdependence among infantry and artillery units in the Vosges fighting. On October 30th, 3rd Battalion of the 442nd finally broke through to the positions of the 1/141. Approximately 211 soldiers of the originally 275-man force were accounted for in the perimeter after nearly a week of isolation. The link-up allowed medical teams and supply parties to move in, while engineers and infantry secured routes for evacuation of wounded and withdrawal of units no longer required to hold the exposed salient. For 7th Army and 36th Division headquarters, the operation closed an immediate tactical crisis by preventing the destruction or capture of a U.S. battalion, but it also highlighted the cost of fighting in the Vosges under late 1944 conditions of constrained manpower and limited operational room. Civilians in nearby villages experienced the operation primarily through its indirect effects. The intensified artillery and small arms fire in the forest, the presence of wounded being brought through rear areas, and the movement of German and American patrols near settlements underscored the volatility of the front. Forest workers and residents of small farms faced restrictions on movement and the risk of being caught between lines or suspected of assisting either side. French local authorities and resistance groups monitored the fighting, but had limited means to influence it, as the engagement centered on remote ridges and ravines rather than on town centers. For the 100th 442nd, the breakthrough marked a turning point in its own campaign trajectory. By mid-November, after further operations towards Saint-Dié, the combined formation had fallen from about 2,943 officers and men when it entered the Vosges to fewer than 800 soldiers available for frontline duty. The 100th, which had fielded 1,432 men a year earlier, now had 239 infantrymen and 21 officers. 2nd Battalion counted 316 riflemen and 17 officers. No company in 3rd Battalion exceeded 100 riflemen. These figures, comparable to attrition patterns in other Allied infantry units engaged in sustained autumn and winter operations, shaped later decisions on how and where to employ the regiment, and how to balance its demonstrated combat effectiveness with the finite pool of available replacements drawn from communities already affected by internment, labor demands, and wartime mobilization. After the Vosges campaign, higher headquarters removed the 100th/442nd from continuous frontline action and sent it to a quieter sector. In November 1944, the regiment moved to the Maritime Alps along the French-Italian border, holding defensive positions near Menton, Sospel, and Saint-Martin-Vesubie. The mission was to guard passes facing German positions in Italy, deter raids, and demonstrate Allied presence along this flank of the front. Patrols, outpost duty, and limited artillery duels replaced the intense assault operations of the Vosges. This period allowed some replacement of casualties and repair of equipment, but overall strength remained well below the regiment's authorized establishment, and many wounded men were still in hospitals across several countries. German units opposite the Maritime Alps front treated this area as a secondary theater. Their orders emphasized economy of force, small garrisons in mountain positions, reliance on terrain, and conservation of ammunition. Both sides used this lull to regroup. For local French civilians, the shift from offensive fighting to static defense reduced the immediate risk of shelling, but maintained restrictions on movement and economic activity. Minefields, demolished bridges, and military traffic continued to affect agriculture and trade in the mountain communities. In March 1945, the combat team divided. The 100th/442nd embarked from Marseille for Italy, while the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion was detached for service in Central Europe. The artillery battalion moved through the Rhone Valley into Germany, supporting U.S. infantry divisions against Siegfried Line positions, and then operating as a mobile unit attached to various formations. Over several weeks, it advanced more than 1,000 kilometers, firing in support of multiple attacks and crossing southern Germany as German forces withdrew toward the Alps. In late April, reconnaissance elements of the 522nd encountered subcamps associated with the Dachau concentration camp system near Hurlach and other localities, and then groups of prisoners on forced marches in the direction of the Alps. Unit reports and later testimonies describe several thousand prisoners, many unable to walk, and bodies along the route. Soldiers provided food, blankets, and medical assistance within the limits of their supplies, while medical teams and higher headquarters organized evacuation of survivors to improvised aid centers. These encounters occurred while the 522nd continued its assigned missions of pursuing retreating German forces and securing routes in southern Germany. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the battalion carried out occupation duties, including roadblocks and sentry posts near Donauwörth, until its return to the United States and deactivation in early 1946. The 100th 442nd, meanwhile, arrived at Leghorn in late March 1945 and joined Fifth Army for the final offensive against the Gothic Line in northern Italy. The German Army Group C had constructed a fortified belt along the Apennines, using tens of thousands of laborers to carve gun pits and bunkers into rock. The Nisei Regiment, attached to the U.S. 92nd Infantry Division, received a sector near the Ligurian coast, where steep mountains rose directly from the sea. Operations orders designated successive objectives with code names such as Ohio, 1, 2, and 3, followed by peaks including Mount Belvedere, Mount Brugiana, and Mount Nebbione, and towns such as Montignoso, Carrara, Ortanovo, and Aula. In early April of 1945, the regiment launched night climbs and surprise attacks against positions thought to be lightly held. When these objectives fell faster than anticipated, higher headquarters converted what had been planned as a diversion into a general offensive along this sector. German commanders, facing pressure across the entire Gothic Line and concerned about encirclement in the Po Valley, began to demolish fortifications and withdraw toward remaining crossings and assembly areas. By 25th April, with the fall of Aula and Mount Nebbione, organized German resistance in this part of Italy collapsed. In the following days, large numbers of German soldiers surrendered to 5th and 8th Armies. The war in Italy formally ended on May 2nd, and overall hostilities in Europe ceased with the general German surrender on May 8th. Italian civilians in the northern Apennines experienced these final operations as a rapid transition from prolonged military occupation to Allied control. German withdrawals, demolition of bridges, and fighting around mountain villages disrupted already strained food supplies and transport. Partisan formations, which had operated in the region in varying coordination with Allied commands, joined in disarming isolated German units and taking custody of prisoners. Allied civil affairs detachments moved to restore local administration, reopen ports such as La Spezia and Genoa, and address the presence of displaced persons, former forced laborers, and prisoners of war. For the 100th 442nd, the end of large-scale combat operations initiated a different kind of transition. The regiment performed security tasks, processed surrendered German personnel, and prepared for possible redeployment, while the U.S. Army as a whole began implementing demobilization plans based on point systems that considered length of service and family status. Men with sufficient points were scheduled for return to the United States, while others faced continued occupation duty in Europe or the prospect of transfer to the Pacific if the war there continued. On the American home front, these developments coincided with the gradual end of mass confinement for Japanese Americans. The exclusion of those deemed loyal from the West Coast was lifted on January 2, 1945. By March, however, only about 1,700 Japanese Americans had returned to the coastal states, with many deterred by housing shortages, hostile local reactions, and uncertainty about employment. As of April 1945, roughly 55,000 people still remained in War Relocation Authority centers. 9 of the 10 main camps closed by the end of that year, with Toul Lake closing in March 1946. Thus, as the 442nd completed its combat operations in Italy and the 522nd carried out occupation duties in Germany, many of the soldiers' families were only beginning the process of leaving camps, reclaiming or replacing lost property, and re-establishing communities on the West Coast or in new locations. For former adversaries, the aftermath also involved reorganization. German units captured by U.S. forces, including those that had opposed the 442nd in Italy and France, entered prisoner of war camps where they awaited processing, interrogation, and eventual repatriation. Italian territories formerly under German occupation shifted to Allied control, and in stages to the authority of the restored Italian government. The military end of fighting in the sectors where the Nisei units had served therefore formed part of a broader reconfiguration of political, economic, and social structures in Europe and in the United States, setting conditions for the long post-war debates over responsibility, citizenship, and memory that would follow. In the years immediately after the war, the units that had composed the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team passed through demobilization and reorganization typical of U.S. ground forces. The combat team was inactivated in 1946 and then reconstituted in the Army Reserve in 1947, garrisoned in Hawaii. Over time, it evolved into the modern 100th Battalion / 442nd Infantry Regiment, aligned with active and reserve commands, and later deployed in conflicts such as Vietnam and Iraq, linking the wartime Nisei formation to post-war U.S. military structures. One of the most cited numerical legacies of the 100th 442nd concerns decorations and casualties. Various official and semi-official tallies agree that approximately 18,000 men served in the combined units and that they received more than 18,000 individual awards, including 21 Medals of Honor, 53 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, over 5,000 Bronze Stars, and several thousand Purple Hearts. Studies of battle and non-battle losses estimate total casualties, including wounded and sick evacuated, at around 9,486, meaning that the number of casualties roughly matched the total number of individuals who passed through the regiment during its wartime service. These figures underpin the frequent designation in U.S. military literature of the 144th and 242nd as the most decorated U.S. Army unit for its size and length of service in the Second World War. Within Japanese-American communities, these numbers and designations have been interpreted in different ways. Veterans and their families often present the record of the 100th 442nd and of related formations, such as the Military Intelligence Service, as evidence that Americans of Japanese ancestry fulfilled obligations comparable to those of other citizens, despite facing removal, confinement, or discrimination at home. Some oral histories emphasize the idea of fighting on two fronts, one against Axis forces abroad, and one for legal recognition in the United States. At the same time, other community voices caution against allowing the combat record to overshadow the experiences of those who declined to serve, protested conditions in the camps, or later focused on legal and political campaigns rather than military service. In national policy, the wartime experience of Nisei units intersected with later efforts to address internment. In the 1970s and 1980s, commissions and congressional hearings reviewed the causes and consequences of exclusion and confinement, concluding that they had been driven by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and failures of political leadership rather than proven military necessity. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 designated H.R. 442 in symbolic reference to the regiment, granted surviving former inmates $20,000 in compensation and a formal federal apology. Veterans of the 100th/442nd and Allied civil rights advocates contributed to this process through testimony, organizational work, and legal expertise alongside other participants in the redress movement. Commemorative institutions have since developed around these histories. Organizations such as the Go for Broke National Education Center in Los Angeles, the Japanese American National Museum, and regional memorials in Hawaii, California, France, Italy, and Germany present exhibits, oral history archives, and educational programs on Japanese American wartime service and incarceration. In Europe, memorials in locations such as Bruyères and Bifontaine in France and sites associated with the Dachau death marches in Germany mark operations in which Nisei units took part, including the Vosges battles and the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion's encounter with prisoners on forced marches near Waukirchen, commemorated by a plaque unveiled in 2025. Former adversaries and local civilians participate in some of these ceremonies, framing the wartime events within broader European narratives of occupation, liberation, and reconstruction. Historians approach the 100th 442nd from several angles. Military studies analyze the regiment's tactics, casualty rates, and operational employment in comparison with other U.S. infantry units in Italy and France, discussing whether the pattern of repeated assignments to difficult sectors reflected neutral assessments of performance, the availability of trained troops, or additional political considerations. Social and legal historians link the unit's experience to questions of citizenship, race, and constitutional rights, tracing how the visibility of Nisei's service influenced post-war debates over immigration as reform, voting rights, and judicial review of wartime decisions. Some scholars highlight tensions between celebratory narratives centered on decorations and sacrifice and critical examinations of state power during crises. In Japan, public awareness of the 442nd has historically been more limited than in the United States, though academic and popular works on the global dimensions of the war sometimes note the paradox that soldiers of Japanese ancestry fought for the United States in Europe, while Japan fought against the United States in the Pacific. In Europe, local memory often focuses less on the origin of specific units and more on the sequence of occupation and liberation, with Nisei formations remembered primarily as part of the larger Allied forces that passed through particular regions. Today, the 100th 442nd occupies a place at the intersection of U.S. military, legal, and social history. For some observers, the regiment represents an example of effective integration of minority soldiers into a mass army. For others, it illustrates how full participation in national institutions occurred alongside, and sometimes in reaction to, policies of exclusion. The same episodes, combat in Italy and France, encounters with concentration camp prisoners, the long return from internment and from overseas deployment, are used to support differing interpretations of national identity, constitutional safeguards, and the limits of security measures in wartime. The historical significance of the 442nd therefore lies not only in its battlefield record, but also in its continuing role in discussions over how democratic states respond to conflict, how they define membership, and how they later interpret decisions taken under the pressures of global war.